The Echo of Solitude. It was a cloudy autumn morning when Thomas, a 32-year-old man, once again sought the depths of solitude. He had always liked the idea of venturing alone, without the need for anyone to guide him or influence his decisions. Since childhood, independence had been his inseparable companion, and he felt that only in the heart of the wild could he truly find peace. He had left behind all his friends and family, always more comfortable on his solitary journeys than in any kind of social commitment. This time, his trip would take him to a distant and untamed place, far from any sign of civilization, a dense forest in the mountains of Wyoming. The plan was simple. 1 week of hiking through isolated trails, camping, and exploring unknown terrain. No company, just him and nature. Thomas had meticulously prepared for the journey. His backpack was packed with survival gear, dehydrated food, and tools for cutting wood and building a shelter. He was confident that nothing could catch him off guard. But as he strayed from the well-known trails and ventured deeper into the thick forest, a sense of unease began to grow within him, like a small spark in a vast field of dry leaves. At night, darkness consumed the forest, bringing with it sounds Thomas had never heard before. The rustling leaves, the creaking of trees, and the distant snapping of branches created a mysterious and unsettling atmosphere. He could smell the damp earth and dense vegetation surrounding him, but the environment seemed more alive than usual. Then, he heard something strange, a murmur, something that sounded like a distant voice. He stopped, trying to identify the sound, but he quickly dismissed it as the wind or his own mind playing tricks on him. Over the next few days, things started to get worse. The solitude that once gave him peace now felt more oppressive. At night, he felt as if he was being watched. He looked around, but there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Even so, he felt the weight of an invisible presence. The sound of footsteps behind him became more frequent, but when he turned to look, nothing was there. Forests had always been mysterious, but what was happening now felt beyond natural. After 3 days, Thomas stumbled upon something he hadn't expected. A long-abandoned hunting cabin covered in moss and on the verge of collapse. Inside, he found remnants of old campfires and signs that someone had lived there long ago. He decided to spend the night, thinking that the structure might offer some sense of security. But it only fueled his paranoia even more. In the absolute silence of the night, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a low, almost unintelligible whisper. He stood up, gripping a pocket knife, and stepped outside to investigate. What he saw left him frozen. A figure stood before him, thin and hunched, its pale, almost translucent skin reflecting the faint moonlight. Its eyes were like 2 black spheres, absorbing all light. He tried to scream, but his throat felt constricted, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. The figure didn't move, but Thomas felt an immense pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was crushing him. He stepped back, his legs trembling, but then the figure's footsteps echoed in the forest, drawing closer. He turned and ran, desperate, without direction, trying to escape the growing weight pressing down on him. These were not hallucinations. He knew that now. Solitude had left him vulnerable, but what he felt now was an indescribable malevolence, something that had been waiting for him. It was as if the forest itself had a consciousness, a primal instinct that had been observing him all along. Over time, Thomas began to realize he was no longer alone. Strange symbols appeared carved into trees along his path, markings he didn't recognize, but which seemed ancient, untouched by time. He felt as if something was guiding him, or rather, hunting him. The footsteps behind him grew louder, quicker. At night, he heard whispers in the shadows and saw faint lights floating between the trees. On one particularly sinister night, Thomas lost his way. The map he had made of the trails disintegrated in his hands, and he could no longer find any recognizable landmarks. The forest seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. His mind was starting to break. It was as if nature itself was slowly unraveling him, draining his vitality, his sanity. He began to wonder if this was part of an eternal cycle, if he was merely prey caught in the trap of something far greater. Finally, he found himself standing before a river. It was too wide to cross without drowning, and he knew he was no longer in a place where he could survive much longer. The feeling that the creature, or whatever it was closing in on him was overwhelming. The whispers were now inside his head, speaking words he couldn't understand. He had become completely lost within his own mind. He knelt by the water's edge, exhausted and on the verge of despair. That was when he felt the presence of something beside him. But when he turned to look, there was nothing. He was no longer on his journey. The forest had taken him to a place where time no longer existed, where the real world was nothing more than a distant memory. Thomas had vanished forever, absorbed by that wild place, by the nightmare he had so eagerly sought. And so, the figure in the forest watched, silent, as the last remnants of a lonely man faded into eternal darkness. The Presence. Upstairs, August 12th, 2020. It was a cold and silent night when Mary realized she was not alone. She'd returned home that morning after spending a week traveling with her parents. They had been staying at her grandparents' house in the countryside. But since her college classes were set to begin on Monday, she decided to return early. Her parents would stay a few more days. When she stepped inside, something felt off. The house was exactly as she had left it. No mess, no signs of an intruder. But there was an unsettling quality in the air, as if the space had changed in her absence. She brushed off the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion from the trip. After a quick meal and a hot shower, she spent the afternoon unpacking. As night fell, she made herself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch, ready to enjoy a quiet evening. Outside, the wind howled, making the tree branches scratch against the windows. The dim light of the television flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Then she heard it. A creak. Upstairs. Mary paused the movie. Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, her breath caught in her throat. Silence. She exhaled slowly, forcing a nervous smile. Old houses creak, especially in the cold. She pressed play and tried to focus on the film. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't a creak. It was footsteps. A cold chill ran down her spine. She sat frozen, her eyes locked onto the staircase leading to the second floor. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Stay calm. Maybe she had left a window open, and the wind had knocked something over. Clutching her phone, she opened the security camera app. The front door feed showed nothing unusual. No movement, no sign of a break-in. She switched to the upstairs hallway camera. Her blood turned to ice. Her parents' bedroom door, which she had closed before leaving that morning, was now slightly open. Mary's breath quickened. She stared at the screen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it wasn't fully shut, and the draft pushed it open. Then she saw it. The door creaked open further. Not slowly, not as if it had been nudged by the wind, as if something was inside. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911. The operator answered. She whispered, barely able to speak, "Someone's in my house, upstairs." The voice on the other end instructed her to leave immediately, but she was too afraid to make any noise. Then the sound came. A loud, heavy thud. Something had fallen, or someone. That was enough. Mary bolted toward the back door, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She sprinted across the yard, nearly tripping on the uneven ground until she reached her neighbor's house. Panting, she pounded on the door. Minutes later, flashing red lights lit up the street. Officers entered her house, weapons drawn, combing through every room. They found no one, no signs of forced entry. All the doors were still locked. Every window was shut tight. But in her parents' bedroom, they did find something. The mirror, fogged up, as if someone had stood close, breathing against the glass. And on the surface, pressed against the condensation, was the imprint of a hand. Mary shivered violently. The police had no answers. They advised her to stay elsewhere for the night and contacted her parents. By morning, her parents were home. Mary expected them to be alarmed, to share in her terror. But they weren't. Instead, they tried to calm her down, brushing off her panic as hysteria, exhaustion, imagination. She broke down, recounting the horror of the previous night, the sounds, the door moving, the mirror, the handprint. Her father simply sighed, a shadow passing over his expression. Then, he said something that sent ice through her veins. "A lot has happened in this house," he murmured. "More than you'd want to know. But there's no reason to be afraid." Mary's breath hitched. Her father knew something he wasn't telling her. They locked eyes for a long moment, tension thick in the air. Then he turned away, walking toward the hallway. Before stepping out of sight, he added, "Let it go." And just like that, the conversation was over. Mary stood there, her heart pounding. Her father knew. Something dark, something hidden deep within the walls of this house. Something her family had kept secret for generations. A secret she wasn't supposed to uncover. The house had seemed warm and familiar her entire life. But now, she saw it differently. It was old. It had history. And something inside it had been waiting. To this day, Mary never learned the full truth. Her parents never spoke of it again, and she never asked. But the feeling, the heavy, suffocating sensation of being watched, never left her. She knew that whatever was there, whatever had touched that mirror, had not left. It was still there, waiting, watching. And worst of all, she was certain that one day it would make itself known again. Sarah and Emily's unforgettable trip. It was October 2023 when Sarah and Emily finally embarked on their dream trip. Friends since college, they had spent 2 years saving every penny, meticulously planning every detail, and researching their itinerary. Their final destination, the paradise beaches of Colombia. As backpackers, they were determined to embrace adventure to the fullest without rigid schedules or restrictions. The trip began in Chicago, with a layover in Mexico City, before heading to Bogotá. The excitement was tangible. They felt freedom coursing through their veins, the thrill of the unknown buzzing in their hearts. When they arrived in Bogotá, everything was going smoothly, until they attempted to check into their Cartagena hotel and were given devastating news. Their reservation didn't start for another 2 days. "But they confirmed it for today," Emily protested, showing the email confirmation. The receptionist apologized, But with the city overflowing due to a festival, there were no available rooms anywhere nearby. That's when a man, standing beside them at the hotel desk, spoke up. He had an easy smile and a confident demeanor. "I know a place. It's simple, but it's affordable and safe. It's a bit outside the city, but I can take you there." It was the same taxi driver who had brought them from the airport. He seemed friendly and helpful, like a local guide who knew where to find hidden gems. Exhausted and out of options, they agreed. The hotel. The drive felt far too long. As they left the city, the bustling streets were replaced by dark, empty roads. Emily tried to make conversation with the driver, asking about the festival, but he responded with only short, vague answers, as if he were uneasy. When they finally arrived, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The hotel was an old colonial-style building, its stained glass windows covered in dust, its dim lights flickering in and out. The driver helped them with their bags, exchanged a glance with an elderly woman behind the reception desk, and whispered something in Spanish that they didn't fully understand. The woman simply stared at them for a moment before handing them a key. She didn't say a single word. The second-floor hallway was narrow and dark. The room number hung crookedly on the door, and the lock looked worn, as if it had been forced open many times before. Sarah hesitated, but Emily, always the braver one, turned the key and pushed open the door. The room was small, with 2 dark wooden beds and a painting of a woman with piercing eyes. On the wall, deep scratches marked the wood, as if someone had clawed at it in desperation. "This place feels like something out of a horror movie," Sarah muttered. Emily laughed. "It's just for 2 nights. We'll laugh about this later." The nighttime sounds. They barely slept. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke up to a sound in the hallway, dragging footsteps. The door handle turned slightly, as if someone was testing if it was locked. Emily woke up too, gripping Sarah's arm, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. No response. Then, a whisper from the other side of the door. Software. Unintelligible. "This isn't normal," Sarah said, her voice shaking. They grabbed their phones and shone the flashlight toward the door. A pair of feet stood just outside, visible through the gap beneath it. Then, the footsteps retreated. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The warning. The next morning, they went to the reception desk to complain. The elderly woman stared at them for a long moment before finally speaking, her voice rough and firm. "If I were you, I wouldn't ask questions. Just stay quiet and wait for your days to pass." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned forward, lowering her voice as if afraid someone or something might hear. "You don't want to know, and if you keep asking, it might be too late." Emily let out a nervous laugh. "We'll just go out for the day and come back only to sleep." The woman nodded slowly. As they walked out, Sarah noticed the receptionist discreetly making the sign of the cross behind them. The last horror. That second night was even worse. The room felt colder, the air heavy. The painting of the woman on the wall looked different. Her neutral gaze had changed. Now she looked anxious. Then they heard it. Tap, tap, tap on the door. The same sound as the night before. Sarah grabbed her phone and aimed the flashlight at the gap beneath the door. This time, there were no feet. The sound had moved inside the room. They turned toward the dark corner. The armchair, which had been empty before, now seemed occupied. Emily clutched Sarah's arm. Someone sat there, Someone was there this whole time. The doorknob started moving again. Without thinking, they bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the hotel without looking back. The taxi driver was already waiting outside, as if he had known they would run that night. He opened the car door without a word. The final revelation. The next morning, back in the city, Sarah and Emily went to a cafe and asked a shopkeeper about the hotel. The man frowned. "There's no hotel at that address. The last one there shut down years ago." "Why?" Emily asked. The man hesitated before finally answering, "Because some people who stayed there never left." Sarah's stomach dropped. Emily pulled out her phone, trying to find the location in her GPS history, but there was no record of the address. Then they realized. The taxi driver. He knew the whole time. He took them there, and then he took them back. But why? And more importantly, what would have happened if they had stayed just one more night? They never found out, and they never wanted to. The Invisible Visitor. Jesse had always been an ordinary person with nothing special in his life. He worked as a computer technician, lived in a small house, and, for years, never had to deal with anything out of the ordinary. But everything changed one rainy October night, when a series of inexplicable events began to unfold in his house. It all started with a strange feeling. For weeks, Jesse had felt that he wasn't alone in his house. It was something vague, a feeling of being watched. But he couldn't find the source of it. At first, he thought it was just the anxiety of work, the accumulated stress. But over time, things began to get more intense. One particularly quiet night, while watching a movie in his living room, Jesse heard a faint sigh coming from the hallway. He thought it was the wind. Maybe the window was not closed properly. But when he went to check, there was nothing. The lights were off. The house was silent, except for the sound of the rain hitting the windows. This was repeated several times over the following weeks. Sounds of footsteps, distant whispers, even the sound of furniture being moved. But when he checked, everything seemed normal. His unease increased. He got used to the feeling of being watched, but began to notice something even more disturbing. He began to see figures in his peripheral field of vision, shadows that disappeared when he tried to focus on them, people he swore had passed through the door, but who were never there when he looked. Jesse decided to investigate. He placed cameras at strategic points in his house, believing that perhaps he was losing his sanity or just hallucinating. When he watched the recordings, his stomach turned. Nothing was happening. But in some of the images, he noticed something strange. In some scenes, a very slight movement, as if a shadow was moving quickly, almost invisibly, as if something was there, but it wasn't completely visible. He tried talking to the neighbors, but no one noticed anything unusual. They simply thought Jesse was exaggerating, until one of them mentioned something that made his skin crawl. The lady next door, an elderly woman called Margaret, said that once, many years before, she had heard a strange noise coming from Jesse's house, but she didn't want to talk about it at the time. She seemed reluctant, as if afraid of remembering something. Sometimes, what we don't see is more real than we realize, she said in a low tone, almost like a warning. As a result, Jesse became even more obsessed with understanding what was going on. He started researching apparitions and unexplained phenomena, reading stories of people who saw things that weren't there, invisible figures that always seemed to be around. He came across an account that made him shudder. People who were haunted by an invisible presence, something that could only be felt and never seen. At some point, these people began to hear its voices, to feel its presence. until finally the shadows became real and the person was possessed, controlled. In the end, the victim disappeared without a trace, as if they had been consumed by something from another dimension. Desperate, Jesse sought professional help. He connected with an expert in paranormal phenomena who suggested that he was being haunted by an invisible entity, something that fed on loneliness and emotional pain. The specialist warned that the entity was approaching a critical stage where it would begin to take shape, and the only way to stop it would be to find the source of the presence. That night, Jesse returned home, feeling more vulnerable than ever. He was convinced that if he didn't find an explanation, he would lose control. When he entered his house, something was different. The lights were flickering and the temperature had dropped dramatically. He felt a strong presence, like an invisible hand pressing down on his chest. The shadow stopped and the atmosphere became even denser. The figure approached more slowly, and suddenly Jesse felt a deep sadness emanating from it. The voice, now clearer, replied, "I am a lost memory. I was taken away abruptly. Here, in this room, my life was taken. They killed me. And I didn't know how to move on. I didn't know how to rest." The voice became weak, as if the shadow was struggling to keep its shape. Jesse felt a wave of compassion, but also a sense of urgency. He knew that this soul needed to be freed, that the terror he felt was a reflection of this entity's suffering. You need to move on," Jesse said softly. "I can help you. Don't stay here any longer. What happened wasn't your fault. You don't deserve to be trapped in this place." The shadow hesitated, as if fighting a deep emptiness inside. Jesse then closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to make the deepest connection with that presence. He spoke words he didn't know where they came from, a plea for her to find peace, to be freed from the suffering that kept her there. For a moment, the shadow seemed to disappear. But before it faded completely, one last soft, almost imperceptible voice echoed in the air. "Thank you.